Let's start where we finished with our own opening statements, and we look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Kerry, in response to our questions, at least. Senator McCaskill and I started this investigation because of these public reports that HHS had placed a number of these unaccompanied children into the hands of human traffickers, specifically this case in Marion, Ohio. When we learned the details of those cases, we were shocked by the fact that HHS had approved these placements. They'd done so without really verifying the sponsors were who they said they were, without noticing the applicants were trying to accumulate multiple children, without even questioning, for instance, whether one sponsor had adequate financial means, who reported on your form that this person was making $200 a week in income, without ever laying eyes on any of the homes the children would live in. Here's one of those homes. This is a trailer you see behind Senator Langford in Marion, Ohio, we talked about earlier. There were multiple children in that one trailer. Worse, when a child welfare worker discovered that one child didn't really live where he was supposed to live, the sponsor refused to allow any follow-up services, just said, no, you can't even check on this child. And HHS policy was to say, fine, you can block these child welfare workers who are on contract with HHS. Close the case, don't do anything. That was policy. I have to tell you that when I heard those details for the first time, I thought, it sounds like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But Mr. Kerry, your deputy director in charge of the unaccompanied children program told our lawyers that, one, she was unaware of any failure to follow HHS policy in the Marion cases, and two, that she was unaware of any alternative practices that would have led to a different outcome. So I guess what I want to ask you both this morning, and I want an answer yes or no, is whether you agree with those conclusions from your deputy. So first, do each of you believe that HHS policy was followed in the Marion cases? Yes or no, please. Do you agree that HHS policy was followed in the Marion cases?
I've been advised by staff that it was followed, the policy that was in effect at the time. I do want to emphasize, as you heard in my remarks and as per my testimony, that we've made a number of...
So your answer is
policies.
HHS policies were followed. Mr. Kerry, what's your answer?
I was not at ORR at the time, but I was informed that policies that were in place at the time were followed for these cases.
So this was based on policy, these horrible situations we've talked about. It's HHS policy that if a child turns out not to live where the sponsor says they will, and a caregiver offering post-release services wants to contact the child and make sure he's okay, the sponsor can refuse those services and block access to a child. Does that offend you? It just doesn't seem like common sense. So maybe I would ask, does anybody in the room think that that's offensive? Raise your hand if you think that's wrong, that you can't even check on a child.
Senator Portman, I do want to be clear that we're following the law that Congress enacted. Under that law, our reading of the law is that we do not have the authority to make these visits mandatory.
Well, laws that Congress actually enacted a specific law to avoid these kind of cases. And in fact, you just talked about it, and you said that if a kid's at risk of trafficking, you have to provide these additional services, and you didn't do it. So that's just not accurate. Let me ask you the second question. Do each of you agree with your deputy that there aren't any alternative practices that would have led to a different outcome? Yes or no?
Senator Portman, I can't speculate. I can't speculate
yes
for
or
an
no.
individual case as to whether that would have been the circumstances.
No, but Mr. Greenberg, you're a guy who has concern for these kids. You have a history of working in this area. You don't think that there could have been a better outcome with alternative practices?
What I can emphasize is that we're continually looking to how to strengthen our practices. As I've described, we've taken a number of steps over this last year to do so. I can't for any specific case say if this practice had been in place, would it have made a difference? But we absolutely want to ensure that we have the needed policies and practices in place, and we welcome the committee's recommendations to us for additional ones that we should consider.
Mr. Carey, do you agree with your deputy that there aren't any alternative practices that would have led to a different outcome?
We are deeply concerned about the well-being of all of the children in the care of ORR and do the utmost in our power.
But let me ask you if you can answer the question, yes or no, please. You're under oath. We've asked you to come here to testify. You didn't do an opening statement. At least answer the question.
With regard to, are there the procedures in place at the time were followed. There are additional procedures that have been put in place since that time. I would be reluctant to speculate what an impact on an ongoing criminally.
Deputy says she's unaware of any alternative practices that would have led to a different outcome. Do you agree with that, yes or no?
I would be reluctant to speculate about what might happen in a case that's part of an ongoing investigation.
Wow. Mr. Greenberg, I want to ask you about a particular policy you've heard a lot about, the department's policy about home studies. As I think one of the other witnesses here today will tell us, state foster care systems, which are a pretty close analogy to what you do, never put a child in a temporary home without laying eyes on the living environment. HHS performed home-in reviews in only about 4% of the cases over the last 3 years. That's the information you gave us, 4%. If you had turned to page 212 of the appendix of the staff report, you'll see an email exchange. This is the appendix to the report, page 212. Do you recognize this email exchange, page 212?
The report has not been shared with us, Senator.
We gave you copies of this email. Let's provide additional copies of the email. Clerk, could you please provide those?
Yeah, and I'm reviewing the email now, Senator.
Okay, you've got the email. Okay, good. My question is, do you recognize this email chain? It's with you. Do you recognize it? Just yes or no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly appears to be our email.
Okay. Let me put this in context. Last summer, ORR was considering expanding home studies. In other words, to actually go and look at these places like this trailer, and decided to require them when a child under age 13 is placed with a non-relative. When that proposal came to you as head of the Administration for Children and Families, you wrote an email to ORR leadership raising concerns about it. Here's what you wrote. Quote, I assume the reason for under 13 is that it's a smaller number for a pilot and that we'll have the greatest concern about young children less able to communicate about their need for help, right? But this is probably less likely to pick up the debt labor group. That's what we're talking about here this morning, the debt labor group, these kids who were forced to work to pay off this debt. Do you think that it would just go too far to extend to all children going to non-relatives? Sensible question. So, Mr. Greenberg, I assume you meant here is that kids 13 and older are more likely to be expected to work and therefore more likely to be forced to work off debt to coyotes and to traffickers. Is that right?
Yes, it is, Senator.
And here you're saying that ORR's policy change is not likely to help kids most vulnerable to labor trafficking. Is that right?
It is on that specific policy.
Yeah, okay.
I have noted a number of additional policies.
You're on to something. Common sense. So in light of the trafficking risks you identified, you sensibly asked ORR, shouldn't we be performing home studies on all non-relatives? This is on page 211 of the appendix. In response, ORR Deputy Director in charge of the Unaccompanied Minors Program wrote back to say this, quote, you are correct about why we chose the younger children and a risk associated with the older children not being included, end quote. In other words, she said, yep, you're right. We're leaving out those kids who are most vulnerable to this debt bondage. That's exactly what happened. HHS approved the policy change without expanding home study to kids older than 13, despite you all knowing what you were doing for these kids who are in the kind of situation we're talking about here today in Marion, Ohio. So my question to you is very simple. Do you think home studies might have prevented the tragedy in Marion? If you'd gone and seen multiple kids living in a trailer like this, do you think there would have been a different result?
So, Senator, as
Yes or no?
indicated, I simply can't speculate as to whether a particular policy would have resulted in a different result. What I can say, and what you can see in my email, is that we were exploring circumstances under which we could expand the use of home studies. I expressly raised to staff the question as to whether we should be doing home studies for all cases involving
And your staff
non-relatives.
apparently
Yeah,
disregarded that, and they didn't follow that policy. And I guess, you know,
Senator,
if you
it was-
can't say this would have prevented the tragedy of Marion, then I think that justifies common sense. I mean, remember, a bunch of these sponsors were sponsors for hire by traffickers. And a bunch of unscrupulous people were trying to accumulate multiple children. That was obvious from any review. You didn't even have to have a home visit to see that if you'd looked at the files. The same address appeared on multiple applications. One of the sponsors appeared on other sponsors' applications under an alias. I just can't believe you wouldn't think that home visits would have revealed what was going on. It just defies common sense.
So, Senator,
I've gone over my time. I'm now going to ask my ranking member, Senator McCaskill, if she has questions for the panel.